Now, let's turn to an important story here in the UK because the public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal of the 70s and 80s continues. Today, we've heard from former Prime Minister Sir John Major. We're going to look at what he said in a moment, but let's remind ourselves that this is a scandal that affected 30,000 people who contracted HIV and hepatitis C across those 2 decades. It happened after they were given a treatment on the National Health Service. Thousands died as a consequence. And the public inquiry into this scandal, which started taking evidence in April 2019, has since had hearings in Belfast, Leeds, Cardiff, Edinburgh and in London. We expect it's going to publish a final report in mid-2023. And today, as I was saying, the inquiry heard from Sir John Major, who was a minister at the time.
There's no amount of compensation you can give that could actually compensate for what had happened to them. What had happened to them was incredibly bad luck, awful, and it was not something that anybody was unsympathetic to.
So Sir John Major described the disaster as bad luck, and you could hear the gasps from those watching. One couple affected by the scandal were Deborah and Barry. Barry was infected with hepatitis C, and they had this to say about Sir John's comments.
I personally don't feel that there's anything genuine there. I don't think he understands the impact that it has had on so many people's lives. Those who have lost their children, their husbands, a life that's been lost.
I can't talk about it.
Well, the BBC's health editor, Hugh has been following this inquiry and following those comments from Sir John Major today.
There have been allegations of a cover-up for some time now amongst victims and campaigners who've been really looking for what they see as justice after decades of being ignored, and then ultimately a battle for compensation because their lives were so blighted by treatment administered by the NHS to them, which resulted in them contracting HIV and hepatitis C and life-changing, life-ending consequences, and not surprisingly described as the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. So Sir John Major, who was a Treasury Minister in the late 1980s, a few years after this scandal had emerged, and then Prime Minister from 1990, was being questioned on why the issue of compensation or financial assistance was not being tackled energetically when he was a minister. And he gave an answer which said nothing can compensate for some of the consequences suffered by victims. And then he went on to make this reference to bad luck. And there were gasps around the room at that point. Later in the day, he was given the opportunity to clarify, and he said he hadn't meant to cause offence or be dismissive. That really hadn't been what he was trying to do, but he was trying to capture the fact that, in his view, this was not a conspiracy. But I think that the words didn't resonate particularly well, and it shows the sensitivity of this issue.
And Hugh, I'm sure there are some people wondering why it's taken until 2022 for some of these questions to be asked. Why didn't this happen far earlier?
Well, indeed, in countries like Japan, the Republic of Ireland, Canada, there have been full investigations. In France, people have been convicted and in some cases jailed for their involvement, because every economy, every health system, or most of them, use these imported blood products back in the late 1970s and early 1980s for treatment of haemophiliacs. But certainly the UK has been very slow to actually face up to these consequences and address the issue of compensation. There have been financial payouts, assistance, a bit like benefits before, but no formal package of compensation as there has been in some other countries for loss of earnings, how lives have been blighted. And that is something that the government at Westminster is now conceding will have to be paid out, and we're going to learn more about that during further evidence to this inquiry.
Hugh, who decides if compensation is paid out and how much compensation is paid out?
Well, the inquiry could take another year under Sir Brian Langstaff, the judge who's heading it, and his conclusions and his report will be studied very carefully. And I think initially the government wanted to hold off until that point, but campaigners made the case strongly that so much evidence had been heard about the distress and the anguish suffered by families and victims that compensation had to be addressed sooner. So the government has conceded that compensation will be paid out, and Sir Robert Francis, an expert on the NHS, has been looking at this whole issue, has come up with an outline plan. He'll give evidence to the inquiry in a few weeks. In terms of the actual numbers, that might take a little longer, but we're going to certainly learn more about this very important issue, I think, before the end of the summer.
Thanks to Hugh for that.